Hello, and welcome to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight, we come to the final chapter of our journey through Anne of Green Gables. This is episode 14, The Bend in the Road. Before we begin, if you've enjoyed traveling through Avonlea with me, I'd love for you to subscribe so you'll always have another cozy story waiting whenever you need a quiet place to rest. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's return to Green Gables one last time. The golden days of autumn gradually gave way to winter. By now, Anne had spent several happy months at Queen's Academy in Charlottetown. The first loneliness of leaving Green Gables had slowly faded, softened by new friendships, busy days of studying, and the comforting knowledge that nearly every weekend she would return home again. Though Queens had become familiar, Green Gables remained the place where her heart always rested. Each Friday evening, when the week's lessons were finished, Anne joined the other Avonlea students aboard the little branch railway bound for Carmody, waiting faithfully at the station were Diana and several of the young people from Avonlea, and together they made their cheerful walk home beneath the wide island skies. Those Friday evenings became the happiest hours of Anne's week. The autumn hills glowed with scarlet maples and golden birches. Cool breezes carried the scent of ripe apples, wood smoke, and fallen leaves. Far ahead, beyond the rolling fields, the welcoming lights of Avonlea twinkled softly as dusk settled over the countryside. Every familiar bend in the road brought her closer to Green Gables. There waited Matthew, whose quiet smile always seemed to brighten at the sound of Anne's voice, and Marilla, whose practical welcome never varied, though Anne had long since learned to hear the affection hidden beneath her sensible words. By Sunday evening, Anne would once again board the train for Charlottetown, carrying with her enough happy memories to brighten another week of study. It was during these weekly walks home that Anne often noticed Gilbert Blythe strolling beside Ruby Gillis. Ruby had grown into a remarkably beautiful young lady. Her bright blue eyes sparkled with laughter. Her complexion was fresh and rosy, and she delighted in pretty clothes and cheerful company. She enjoyed life simply and openly, finding happiness in dances, parties, and pleasant conversation. One Friday evening, Jane Andrews leaned quietly toward Anne. "I shouldn't think Ruby is the sort of girl Gilbert really would like," she whispered. Anne smiled thoughtfully. She found herself secretly agreeing. It was not that Ruby lacked kindness. Rather, Anne had come to recognize that Gilbert possessed an unusually thoughtful mind. He enjoyed discussing books, ideas, ambitions, and all the possibilities that stretched beyond the present day. Somehow, she couldn't imagine Ruby taking much pleasure in such conversations. Before she realized it, Anne found herself wondering how different things might have been if she and Gilbert had become friends years before. There was no foolish romance in the thought. Anne scarcely thought of boys in that way at all. To her, they were simply companions who might become loyal friends, just as girls did. She already had many dear girlfriends, but she had begun to feel that a true friendship with someone as thoughtful as Gilbert might have been another kind of blessing altogether. Sometimes she imagined how pleasant those Friday walks might have been. She and Gilbert could have talked together across the autumn fields about poetry and history, about the books they loved, about Miss Stacy's lessons, and about the dreams each secretly carried for the future. Gilbert was clever, earnest, and full of quiet determination. Ruby herself laughingly confessed that she rarely understood half the things Gilbert talked about. "He speaks just like Anne Shirley when she gets into one of her thoughtful fits," Ruby had once declared. "I don't see why anyone wants to bother talking about books when there are so many more amusing things." Anne couldn't help smiling when she heard it. Life had a curious way of revealing how alike two people truly were, even when they spent so much effort pretending otherwise. As the weeks slipped quietly into months, Anne found herself surrounded by new companions whose hearts delighted in many of the same things she loved. Among them were Stella Maynard, who everyone affectionately called the Rose-Red Girl, and gentle Priscilla Grant, known as the Dream Girl. Stella possessed bright black eyes and a heart overflowing with beautiful dreams and romantic fantasies that often matched Anne's own. Priscilla appeared pale and quiet and almost solemn at first acquaintance, yet beneath her gentle appearance lived a delightful sense of humor and a talent for harmless mischief that frequently sent the two girls into peals of laughter. Together, they formed one of those easy friendships that seemed to spring into bloom almost overnight. Christmas came and quietly passed, and after the holidays, the Avonlea students no longer made their weekly journeys home every Friday. Winter tightened its snowy grip upon Prince Edward Island, and everyone settled down to the serious business of study. By now, each student had found his or her own proper place within Queen's. The classes had settled into their natural order, and certain things had become generally accepted among the pupils. It was widely believed that only 3 students remained serious contenders for the English medal: Gilbert Blythe, Anne Shirley, and Lewis Wilson. The Avery Scholarship was still uncertain, with several excellent scholars competing for it, while other distinctions quietly found their owners. Ruby Gillis was generally acknowledged to be the beauty of the school. Jane Andrews earned admiration for her careful work in domestic science. Even Josie Pye became famous for possessing the sharpest tongue at Queen's. Looking back upon Miss Stacy's old pupils, Anne felt quietly proud. The boys and girls from Little Avonlea had held their own among students from every corner of Prince Edward Island. Anne herself worked steadily and faithfully throughout the long winter. Her rivalry with Gilbert remained as keen as ever, though few of their classmates ever suspected it. But something within Anne had changed. The bitterness that had once colored every contest between them had slowly disappeared. She no longer wished to win merely for the pleasure of defeating Gilbert Blythe. Now, she wished only to do her very best. If she earned victory over so worthy an opponent, the triumph would be deeply satisfying. And if Gilbert should prove the stronger scholar after all, Anne no longer believed that life would be unbearable. She had discovered a quieter kind of kindness, the satisfaction of striving wholeheartedly beside someone who inspired her to become the very best version of herself. And somehow, though she did not fully understand it, that seemed the finer victory of all. Winter slowly loosened its hold upon Prince Edward Island. The snowbanks that lined the roads for so many months began to shrink beneath the strengthening sun. Tiny streams of melted snow hurried across the fields. The trees dressed themselves in soft green buds, and before long, the first brave violets peeped shyly through the warming earth. At Queen's Academy, however, the changing seasons passed almost unnoticed. The students had entered the busiest weeks of the school year. Every day brought another lesson to master, another essay to complete, another examination drawing steadily nearer. Morning recitations blended into afternoon lectures, and evenings were spent bent over books until the lamps burned low. Yet life was not made entirely of study. Whenever Sunday arrived, Anne gladly accepted Aunt Josephine Barry's standing invitation to spend the afternoon at Beechwood. Those quiet hours became a welcome rest from the demands of Queen's. Aunt Josephine delighted in hearing every detail of academy life, and Anne always left feeling refreshed in both mind and spirit. Beechwood itself seemed to possess a peaceful magic all its own. The gracious old house overlooked broad lawns where the first flowers of spring were beginning to bloom. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, filling the drawing room with warmth, while tea was served with delicate cakes and lively conversation. Aunt Josephine listened with genuine interest as Anne described her professors, her classmates, and the endless lessons that now filled her days. "My dear Anne," she often said with an affectionate smile, You work far too hard." "I don't think I could work any other way," Anne would answer with a laugh. "Not while the Avery Scholarship is waiting for someone." "And would the world truly end if someone else won it?" Anne's gray eyes sparkled. "No, but I should be dreadfully disappointed." Aunt Josephine laughed softly. "I believe disappointment only teaches us how deeply we cared." Those peaceful Sunday afternoons restored Anne's spirits. By Monday morning, she returned to Queens with a renewed determination, ready to face another week of demanding lessons. Outside, spring advanced almost day by day. The bare branches softened into clouds of fresh green leaves. Apple orchards prepared themselves for blossom. The air grew gentler, carrying the fragrance of damp earth and unfolding life. Robins filled the mornings with cheerful song, and every corner of Prince Edward Island seemed quietly occupied with becoming beautiful once again. As spring deepened into May, conversation among the students changed. No one spoke much anymore about Christmas holidays or winter amusements. Instead, every discussion seemed to return to examinations. Ruby Gillis confessed she had begun dreaming each night that she had forgotten every lesson she had ever learned. Jane Andrews worried she would somehow misread every question on the examination papers. Josie Pye declared that she felt perfectly calm, though very few of her classmates believed her. Even Priscilla admitted she sometimes woke in the middle of the night trying to remember dates from history or rules of grammar. Anne herself occasionally felt a flutter of nervousness. There were moments when she closed her books and wondered if she overlooked some important lesson, forgot some essential fact, or failed to prepare as thoroughly as she should. Then she would quietly remind herself that worry had never yet answered a single examination question. The only remedy was steady work. And so she continued, day after day, lesson after lesson, always with the same quiet determination that Miss Stacy had first encouraged years before in the little schoolhouse at Avonlea. One warm evening, Anne and Stella Maynard lingered outside after classes had ended. The western sky glowed with soft shades of rose, amber, and lavender. A gentle breeze stirred the budding maple branches overhead, and somewhere, nearby, a robin greeted the fading light with its evening song. "I'm almost longing for the examinations to be over," Stella admitted with a sigh. "I'm so tired of thinking about them." Anne rested her hands upon the fence and smiled. "I suppose I'll be relieved when they're finished," she said. "But I think I'll miss all this striving." Stella looked at her in surprise. "Miss it?" "Yes," Anne answered thoughtfully. "There's something wonderfully satisfying about giving every bit of yourself to reaching a goal. Sometimes I think the anticipation is almost as lovely as the achievement." She gazed toward the distant fields, where tiny patches of violet blue were beginning to appear beneath the hedgerows. "Spring always reminds me of that." Stella waited quietly. "The violets bloom first," Anne continued, "and then we begin looking forward to the apple blossoms. And after the apple blossoms come the wild roses. And after the roses comes summer. Each beautiful thing promises another still more beautiful waiting just ahead." She smiled gently. "I wouldn't want to hurry through spring simply because summer is coming." For a little while, neither girl spoke. The evening settled peacefully around them as the last golden light slipped below the horizon. Anne found herself wondering what the months ahead might hold. Perhaps the Avery Scholarship. Perhaps Redmond College. Perhaps dreams she had scarcely dared to imagine. She couldn't know what waited beyond the coming examinations. But as she stood beneath the quiet spring sky, surrounded by the promise of another island summer, she felt content simply to keep moving forward, one lesson, one day, and one hopeful step at a time. for she had learned that there was joy not only in reaching one's destination, but also in the faithful, hopeful striving that carried one there. Summer had come again to Prince Edward Island. The orchards were dressed in blossoms, soft white petals drifting through the warm morning air whenever a gentle breeze wandered over the hills. Along the quiet streets of Charlottetown, young scholars hurried toward Queen's Academy, each carrying hopes that had been growing for many months. For Anne Shirley, however, the beauty of the morning scarcely existed. She walked beside Jane Andrews toward the academy, her hands clasped tightly before her. Around them, students chatted happily, laughing now that the examinations were behind them. Some were already making plans for summer holidays. Others spoke confidently of teaching positions or of returning home before the beginning of the next chapter of their lives. Jane seemed almost as cheerful as sunshine itself. "I'm so thankful the examinations are finished," she said with a relieved smile. "Whatever happens now, I feel I've done my best." Anne returned the smile, though it was a faint one. "I'm glad they're over too," she admitted, "but I don't believe my heart will truly rest until I know the results." Only a few minutes remained before the final examination list would be posted. Those few minutes seemed longer than all the months of study that had gone before. Jane looked at Anne with an affectionate confidence. "Of course you'll win one of the honors," she declared. "Everybody knows how brilliantly you've done." Anne shook her head. "I've no hope of the Avery," she confessed quietly. "Everyone says Emily Clay will surely win it." She hesitated before continuing. "And I simply haven't the courage to stand in front of that bulletin board while everyone is watching. I'm going straight to the girls' dressing room, Jane. Will you read the announcements for me?" Jane laughed gently. "Certainly." "If I've failed," Anne continued with unusual seriousness, "please, just tell me plainly. And whatever you do, don't sympathize with me. Promise." "I promise." Together they climbed the broad stone steps of Queen's Academy. But before they even reached the entrance hall, an enormous cheer burst through the building. "Hooray for Blythe! Hooray for the medalist!" A crowd of boys surged through the hallway carrying Gilbert Blythe high upon their shoulders. For one dreadful instant, Anne's heart seemed to stop. Gilbert had won. Then she had lost. A sharp wave of disappointment swept over her before she could master it. It wasn't jealousy. She could rejoice in Gilbert's success. But she had hoped, oh, how she had hoped, that Matthew and Marilla might be proud of her. She thought of Matthew's quiet confidence whenever he had spoken of her studies, how he believed so completely that she would succeed. She wondered how disappointed he would be. Then another voice rang above the cheering. "3 cheers for Miss Shirley, the winner of the Avery Scholarship." For a heartbeat, Anne could scarcely understand the words. Jane gave a delighted cry. "Oh, Anne!" Before Anne could answer, girls surrounded her from every direction. Hands grasped hers warmly. Shoulders were affectionately patted. Congratulations came so quickly that they blended together into one joyful chorus. "You've won! The Avery! We knew you would! How splendid!" Anne felt herself laughing through the tears she had not yet realized were gathering. Everything had happened so suddenly that it scarcely seemed real. The disappointment of only a moment before vanished like a cloud carried away by the wind. She hadn't failed. She had won. And not merely a prize, but the scholarship that would make her long dream of Redmond College possible. In the midst of all the excitement, she had leaned toward Jane and whispered the very first thought that came into her heart. "Oh, won't Matthew and Marilla be pleased?" Her eyes shone with happiness. "I must write home immediately." And the days that followed passed in a whirl of preparation for the commencement. the great assembly hall of Queen's Academy filled with proud families and friends who had come from every part of the island. Diplomas were presented, essays were read aloud, songs echoed beneath the high ceiling, and prizes and medals found their rightful owners. Among all the students seated upon the platform was Anne. She wore a simple pale green dress that suited her fresh coloring beautifully. As she rose to read her prize essay, her clear voice carried easily through the hall. Matthew and Marilla watched from the audience. To them, no one else upon the stage truly existed. Matthew scarcely took his eyes from Anne for a single moment. When she finished reading, he leaned quietly towards Marilla. "Reckon you're glad we kept her, Marilla." Marilla's lips trembled ever so slightly. "It's not the first time I've been glad," she answered, pretending a firmness she did not quite feel. "You do like to remind me of it, Matthew Cuthbert." Behind them, Mrs. Barry leaned forward with a pleased smile. "Aren't you proud of that Anne girl?" she whispered. "I know I am." By evening, the ceremonies were over, and Anne rode home with Matthew and Marilla beneath the soft glow of the late spring sky. As Green Gables came into view once more, her heart overflowed with quiet joy. The apple trees were heavy with blossoms. The field stretched green and peaceful beneath the fading sunlight. And when Anne stepped once more into her own little room beneath the eaves, she paused at the open window. Outside stood the beloved Snow Queen, clothed in white plumes. The pointed firs rose dark against a sky brushed with pink. The fragrance of mint drifted upward from the garden below, drawing a long, happy breath, and Anne smiled. "Oh," she whispered softly, "it's so very good to be home." The first morning at Green Gables felt almost dreamlike after so many months at Queen's Academy. Anne awoke beneath the sloping roof of the east gable, and for a little while simply lay listening. The window stood open to the sweet June air, and robins sang cheerfully among the blossoming apple trees, while somewhere beyond Orchard Slope, a meadowlark poured its bright song into the quiet morning. Sunlight drifted softly across the quilt upon her bed, and the familiar fragrance of mint and wild roses floated in on the gentle breeze. It was home. The very word wrapped itself around Anne's heart like a warm embrace. When she came downstairs, Diana was already waiting. The two friends laughed as though they had scarcely been apart at all, wandering together through the orchard where the last blossoms fluttered lazily to the grass. "Oh, Diana," Anne exclaimed, drawing in a deep breath, "I had forgotten how beautiful Green Gables is in June. Look at the Snow Queen. Isn't she glorious?" The great cherry tree stood clothed in snowy blossoms, every branch shimmering against the clear blue sky. "And the mint," Anne laughed. "I never knew until I left how wonderful it smells, and even the tea roses seem happier here than anywhere else." Diana smiled affectionately. "I thought perhaps you'd grow too grand for Avonlea, now that you've won the Avery." Anne gave a merry laugh. "Too grand? Never. Stella Maynard is delightful, and I love Priscilla dearly, but no one could ever take your place, Diana." Diana pretended to sigh with relief. "Josie Pye insisted you become infatuated with Stella." Anne plucked one of the fading June lilies from her bouquet and tossed it gently toward her friend. "Josie Pye always believes the most interesting story she can invent. Stella is charming, but you're my Diana." For a long while they talked as they always had. Anne described the girls at Queen's, the professors, the long evenings of study, the laughter in the boarding house, and the excitement of the commencement day. Then Diana asked quietly, "So, you'll be going to Redmond in September?" Anne's eyes brightened. "Oh, yes. It hardly seems real yet. 3 whole months of holiday first, And then Redmond at last? Jane and Ruby would both be teaching in the autumn, and Anne was delighted that all of Miss Stacy's old pupils had done so well. Then Diana mentioned something Anne had not expected. Gilbert won't be going to college this year. Anne looked up surprised. He won't? Diana shook her head. His father can't afford to send him just yet. Gilbert means to teach for a year first. Everyone expects he'll have Avonlea school if Miss Ames leaves. For just a moment, Anne was silent. She had always imagined Gilbert walking the same halls as Redmond that she would. Their rivalry had become so familiar that she had scarcely imagined continuing her studies without it. She smiled a little at herself. "It won't be quite the same without my friend the enemy," she admitted. When Diana returned home, Anne found Matthew and Marilla already at breakfast. As they talked together, Anne studied Matthew more closely than she had the evening before. A little uneasiness stirred within her. His shoulders seemed more bent. His hair looked grayer. There was a weariness about his face that she had never noticed before. When he had gone out to begin the morning's work, Anne turned anxiously toward Marilla. "Is Matthew quite well?" Marilla's expression became thoughtful. "Well, he hasn't been as strong this spring as I'd like. His heart has troubled him more than once, though he tries to pretend otherwise. He simply won't spare himself." Anne reached across the table and gently took Marilla's hands. "And you don't look rested yourself." Marilla smiled faintly. "My eyes trouble me a good deal now. Reading and sewing bring on dreadful headaches. Dr. Spencer wants me to see an eye specialist when one comes to the island later this month." Anne listened quietly. Then Marilla's thoughts turned to another worry. "Have you heard anything lately about Abbeybank?" "I heard someone say it was a little uncertain," Anne answered. Marilla nodded. "Rachel mentioned the same thing. Matthew was concerned because every dollar we've saved is there. I wanted him to move it long ago, but he believes the bank is perfectly safe." Anne tried to reassure her. "The old Mr. Abbey is the only figurehead now. Surely the younger men are managing things wisely." "I do hope so," Marilla replied. The conversation soon drifted to other matters, and Anne determined that, for this one perfect day at least, she would not spend it worrying. She wandered once more through every beloved corner of Green Gables. She visited the Dryad's Bubble, where the little spring still sang beneath the ferns. She lingered in Violet Vale until the afternoon sunshine turned the blossoms into little pools of blue. She called upon Mrs. Allen at the manse and found the familiar kindness there unchanged. Every path seemed to welcome her home. That evening, Matthew asked if she would walk with him to bring in the cows. Together, they followed Lover's Lane beneath arching branches touched with the golden light of sunset. The woods glowed around them. Birdsong drifted through the trees. Matthew walked more slowly than he once had, and Anne quietly matched her steps to his. "You've worked too hard today, Matthew," she said gently. "Why won't you take things a little easier?" Matthew smiled his shy smile. "I don't seem able to, Anne. I've always worked, and I suppose I've forgotten how to stop." Anne looked at him affectionately. "If I'd been the boy you sent for, I could help you so much now." Matthew stopped and laid one work-worn hand softly upon hers. "Well now," he said, smiling into her face, "I'd rather have you than a dozen boys." His eyes shone with quiet pride. "It wasn't a boy that won the Avery Scholarship." He paused. "It was my girl." Anne felt those simple words settle deeply within her heart. Long afterward, she would remember them. That night she sat for a long while at her open window beneath the silver moon. The Snow Queen glimmered softly outside. Frogs sang peacefully beyond Orchard Slope, and everything seemed wrapped in a quiet beauty and gentle contentment. Anne breathed deeply of the fragrant summer air, believing with all her heart that life stretched before her as far and peaceful as this June evening. She didn't know it yet, but this would be the last night before sorrow entered Green Gables. The golden days of early summer settled gently over Green Gables. The orchard, so lately clothed in drifting blossoms, now shimmered beneath a canopy of rich green leaves. Along the garden paths, roses unfurled one by one, filling the warm air with their delicate fragrance. Bees hummed lazily among the flowers, robins sang from the orchard fence, and the soft breezes wandered through Lover's Lane, stirring the ferns beneath the great trees. Everything seemed peaceful. Everything seemed exactly as it always had been. It was one of those quiet June mornings that appeared too beautiful to hold even the smallest shadow. Anne had risen early and wandered into the garden with a basket over her arm. She was gathering white narcissus, whose pure blossoms gleamed softly in the sunshine. They had always been among Matthew's favorite flowers, though he had seldom spoke of such things aloud. Anne smiled as she filled her basket, thinking how lovely they would look arranged in the old blue pitcher upon the dining room table. She lingered happily among the flower beds, pausing now and then simply to breathe the sweet morning air. Then, from inside the house, Marilla's voice rang out. "Matthew! Matthew! What's the matter? Matthew, are you sick?" There was something in her tone Anne had never heard before. Alarm. Her basket slipped against her arm as she hurried toward the house, the white blossoms trembling with every step. She reached the kitchen doorway just in time to see Matthew standing on the threshold. One hand still clutched a folded newspaper. His face had turned strangely pale. His eyes looked distant, as though he were trying to understand something beyond the room before him. "Matthew!" Anne cried. She and Marilla sprang toward him all together. But they were too late. Before either of them could reach him, Matthew staggered forward and fell silently across the doorway. The basket slipped from Anne's hands. White narcissus scattered across the worn kitchen floor. For one frozen instant, no one moved. Then Marilla knelt beside her brother. "He's fainted," she gasped, though already fear had entered her voice. "Anne, run for Martin, quickly. He's at the barn." Anne flew. Never had Green Gables seemed so large. She scarcely remembered crossing the yard. Her feet seemed to carry her of her own accord as she called for Martin, the hired man. Within moments, he was racing for the horse. "I'll fetch the doctor," he shouted. "I'll stop at Orchard Slope and send Mr. and Mrs. Barry, too." The wagon disappeared down the lane in a cloud of dust. Neighbors began arriving almost immediately. Mrs. Rachel Lynde, who had been passing on an errand, hurried into the house before the doctor came. Anne scarcely noticed who entered or who left. She knelt beside Matthew, holding one of his hands between both of hers. It already felt strangely still. Mrs. Lynde gently touched Anne's shoulder. "My dear, let me see." With quiet experience, born from many years, she bent beside Matthew. She felt for his pulse. Then she laid her ears against his heart. When she looked up again, tears stood in her eyes. "Oh, Marilla," she said softly, "I don't think we can do anything for him." Anne stared at her. The words seemed impossible. They belonged to another world. "Mrs. Lynde," she whispered, You can't think Matthew is..." She couldn't speak the final word. Mrs. Lynde took Anne's cold hand into her own. "My child," she answered gently. "I'm afraid he is. Look at his face. When you've seen that look as often as I have, you know what it means." Slowly, Almost unwillingly, Anne looked. Only yesterday evening Matthew had smiled shyly at her beneath the sunset. My girl that I'm proud of. Now his face had become wonderfully calm. Every line of care had vanished. It seemed almost as though he had simply fallen asleep after a long day's work. Anne felt, without fully understanding it, that something holy had entered the quiet room. When the doctor finally arrived, there was nothing he could do except explain what had happened. Death, he said, had come instantly and without pain. The shock had been too great. Only afterward did they discover the cause. The folded newspaper Matthew had carried home from the post office contained the terrible news that the Abbey Bank had failed. Every dollar that the Cuthberts had saved through years of patient labor had been entrusted there. The sudden blow falling upon a heart already weakened had been more than Matthew could bear. Word spread swiftly through Avonlea. Throughout the day, neighbors came and went with baskets of food, quiet voices, willing hands, and every kindness they knew how to offer. The little farmhouse that had always been so peaceful filled with hushed footsteps. For the first time in his quiet life, shy Matthew Cuthbert became the center of the entire community's love. As evening slowly settled over Green Gables, the house grew still once more. The day's voices faded. The sunset deepened into lavender and silver. In the parlor lay Matthew, dressed with loving care. His gentle gray hair framed the familiar face that now wore the faintest hint of the shy smile Anne always loved. Around him, she placed the old-fashioned flowers blooming in the garden, flowers planted long ago by Matthew's mother, flowers he had cherished all his life without ever speaking much about them. It was the last gift Anne could give him. When darkness finally gathered outside the windows, Diana quietly climbed the stairs to the east gable. Anne stood beside the open window, looking out across the moonlit orchard without really seeing it. "Anne, dear," Diana said softly, "would you like me to stay with you tonight?" Anne turned and took both of Diana's hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "But I think I want to be alone." She tried to smile, though it scarcely came. "I'm not afraid. I need to understand it." Diana kissed her gently and left. The room became very still. Outside, the first stars appeared above the dark hills. And inside, Anne remained by the window, her hands folded tightly together. She waited for tears that would not come. There was only a great, aching emptiness where joy had lived that very morning. And beneath the quiet beauty of the summer night, Anne kept her first lonely vigil with sorrow. Night settled softly over Green Gables. The familiar house, once so full of quiet comfort, seemed wrapped in a silence unlike any Anne had ever known. Even the summer breeze drifting through the open windows seemed to move more gently, as though it, too, understood that sorrow had entered the old farmhouse. Downstairs, Matthew rested peacefully in the parlor among the flowers Anne had gathered for him. Upstairs, in the east gable, Anne stood alone beside her window. Beyond the orchard, the stars shone with calm brilliance above the dark hills. The frogs sang steadily in the marsh beyond the orchard slope, just as they always had on warm June evenings. The whole world appeared unchanged. Yet, nothing was the same. Anne had thought the tears would come once she was alone. Surely they must. She had loved Matthew with all the quiet devotion of her heart. He had been her first true friend at Green Gables, the gentle soul who had understood her even when no one else had, who had brought home puffed sleeves and pearl beads, who had smiled whenever she dreamed aloud. And yet, no tears came. Only a heavy, aching numbness settled over her, so deep that it filled every corner of her heart. She knelt beside the open window and tried to pray. The familiar words came slowly. Above her, the stars burned with their ancient, peaceful light, while below, the orchard rested beneath the silver moonlight. Still, she couldn't weep. At last, worn out by sorrow more exhausting than any labor, Anne lay down upon her bed. Sleep came only fitfully. Then, sometime, in the deep hours of the night, she awoke. For one blessed moment she didn't remember. The room was dark. The house was still. Then, the memory returned all at once. Matthew. She saw him again as he stood smiling at the pasture gate only the evening before. My girl that I'm proud of. His gentle voice seemed to echo through the darkness. Then the numbness broke. The tears came suddenly and without restraint. Anne buried her face in her pillow and wept all the grief her heart had been unable to release before. The sound reached Marilla, and a few moments later the door opened quietly. Marilla crossed the room and sat beside Anne upon the bed. There, dearie, she whispered, laying one arm around her. Don't cry so. It can't bring him back. I knew that today, but I couldn't help crying either. He was such a good brother to me. Oh, let me cry, Anne sobbed. The tears don't hurt the way the aching did. Stay with me a little while, Marilla. She clung to her. I couldn't let Diana stay. She loves me dearly, but this isn't her sorrow. It's ours. Marilla held her close. For a long time, neither spoke. At last, Marilla's voice came quietly through the darkness. We've got each other now, Anne. She paused. I don't know what I'd do if you weren't here, if you'd never come to Green Gables. Anne lifted her tear-filled eyes. Marilla rarely spoke of her feelings. Every word cost her an effort. I know I'm often strict, Marilla continued, perhaps even harsh, but you must never think I don't love you as much as Matthew did. I've never found it easy to say such things, but tonight I can. She gently brushed Anne's hair away from her face. I love you as dearly as though you were my own child. The words settled into Anne's heart like a blessing. She wrapped both arms around Marilla. Neither of them tried to hide their tears any longer. Outside, the moon continued its silent journey above the orchard. Inside, the two lonely hearts found comfort in one another. 2 days later, the little procession left Green Gables. Neighbors stood quietly along the lane as Matthew Cuthbert was carried from the home that he had loved his whole life, the fields he had patiently cultivated, the orchards he had planted, the woods where he had walked so often. All seemed to bid him a gentle farewell. When the last of the visitors had gone home, Avonlea slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. The cows still needed milking. The gardens still needed tending. Meals still had to be prepared. To Anne, this seemed almost unbelievable. How could ordinary life continue when Matthew was gone? Sometimes she felt almost ashamed to discover that beauty could still touch her heart. One bright morning, the sunrise painted the eastern sky with delicate shades of pink. The birds sang joyfully outside her window, and for one brief instant Anne forgot herself and smiled. The smile vanished almost immediately. It seems almost disloyal, she confessed one evening as she walked with Mrs. Allen through the quiet garden at the manse. I miss Matthew every hour, and yet the world still seems beautiful to me. Diana said something funny today, and I laughed before I thought. Afterwards, I felt as though I ought not have laughed at all. Mrs. Allen smiled with a gentle understanding. When Matthew was here, she said softly, he loved to hear you laugh. Do you think he would wish you never to laugh again? Anne looked thoughtfully down at the little path beneath her feet. I hadn't thought of it that way. We all feel that guilt, Mrs. Allen continued. When someone we love is gone, we almost resent finding happiness again. But God has filled the world with beauty to help heal sorrow, not to betray it. Anne was quiet for several moments. This afternoon, she said dreamily, I planted a little white Scotch rosebush on Matthew's grave. Mrs. Allen smiled. The one his mother brought from Scotland? Anne nodded. Matthew always loved those roses best. Somehow it comforts me to think he will always be near them. The evening shadows lengthened. I must go home now, Anne said at last. Marilla gets lonely at twilight. Mrs. Allen watched her walk away toward Green Gables. Anne's step was slower now than it had once been. Yet, as she passed beneath the whispering trees and saw the familiar roof waiting in the fading light, she knew that whatever lay ahead, she and Marilla would walk through it together. And that quiet knowledge was the first small thread of hope beginning to weave itself gently through sorrow. The golden days of early summer settled gently over Green Gables. The orchard shimmered beneath clouds of white blossoms. Clover nodded beside the winding lanes, and every breeze carried the cool sweetness of mint and wild roses. The world outside seemed determined to go on blooming, even after sorrow had visited the old farmhouse. For Anne, the days had become quieter than they had ever been before. Matthew's gentle footsteps no longer crossed the yard each morning. His familiar voice no longer greeted the cows in the pasture or wished Marilla good night across the supper table. Yet his kindness lingered in every corner of Green Gables, woven so deeply into the place Anne often found herself expecting to see him turn the bend in the lane or hear the creak of the porch gate. Grief had changed her, not by taking away her imagination or her joy in beautiful things, but by making both gentler, steadier, and deeper. She had begun to understand that love never truly vanished. It remained quietly with those who remembered. One evening, Marilla returned from Charlottetown later than Anne had expected. Anne had spent the afternoon with Diana at Orchard Slope and came home humming softly as she crossed the yard. But the moment she entered the kitchen, her song faded. Marilla sat beside the table with one elbow resting upon its worn wooden surface, her head leaning wearily against her hand. Never before had Anne seen her look so utterly defeated. She hurried across the room. "Marilla, are you very tired?" Marilla lifted her head slowly. "Yes. No. I scarcely know. I suppose I am tired. But that isn't what troubles me." Anne knelt beside her chair. "You saw the eye specialist today. What did he say?" For several moments Marilla didn't answer. Then she spoke quietly. "He examined my eyes very carefully. He says that if I'm willing to give up reading and sewing and every kind of work that strains my sight, and if I wear the glasses he's prescribed, there's hope." Anne let out a breath that she had been holding. "Oh, Marilla, then there is hope." "But if I don't obey him," Marilla continued in the same calm voice, "he says I'll likely be blind within 6 months. The words seemed to still the very air. Outside, a robin sang somewhere beyond the orchard, unaware that the world inside Green Gables had shifted once again. Anne reached for Marilla's hands. "Then we'll do exactly as he says." Marilla smiled faintly, though sadness lingered in her eyes. "It isn't easy to think of giving up work I've always done. Reading, sewing, caring for the house. They've been my life." "You won't lose them," Anne said gently. "Only share them." Marilla looked at her with quiet affection. "You always did know how to find the hopeful side." Anne managed a small smile. "I learned from Green Gables." Miller reached out and brushed a loose strand of auburn hair from Anne's forehead. "My eyes aren't the only trouble," she hesitated. "Rachel told us that the Abbey Bank is in difficulty. Anne remembered the newspaper Matthew had carried home, the dreadful paper that had fallen beside him on the porch. "I'd heard rumors," she said softly. "We've lost everything." The words fell in silence with terrible simplicity. "Every penny Matthew and I saved through all our lives was there." Anne felt the room sway around her. Matthew had worked from dawn until twilight for decades. Marilla had pinched every household expense, every careful saving. Gone. "There are still notes on the farm to pay," Marilla continued quietly. "Without the money, I don't see how Green Gables can be kept." Anne stared at her. "What do you mean?" Marilla looked toward the window where the orchard glowed in the evening light. "I've been thinking. There is nothing for it but to sell." For one long moment Anne could not speak. Sell Green Gables, the old house where Matthew had welcomed her, the White Way of Delight, Lover's Lane, the Snow Queen, the orchard where childhood dreams had first taken root. It seemed impossible. A few days later, Mr. Sadler from Carmody came to the house. Anne watched him leave before turning anxiously toward Marilla. What did Mr. Sadler want? Marilla sat slowly in her chair beside the window. "He wishes to buy Green Gables." Anne felt every drop of color leave her face. "Buy it?" Marilla nodded. "I don't know what else can be done. With my eyesight failing, I can't manage the farm. Without our savings, we can't keep it." Her voice broke. "I never thought I'd live to see the day when I'd have to leave my own home." Tears slipped down her cheeks despite the doctor's warning. Anne crossed the room in 2 quick steps and knelt beside her. "You mustn't sell Green Gables." "Oh, Anne," Marilla whispered, "I wish there were another way." "There is." Marilla looked up. Anne's voice was quiet now, but perfectly steady. "You won't have to stay here alone." Marilla frowned. "What do you mean?" Anne drew a slow breath. "I'm not going to Redmond." For several seconds, Marilla simply stared at her. "I'm giving up the Avery scholarship." "You can't mean that." "Oh, I do." Anne smiled, a peaceful smile unlike any Marilla had ever seen. "I decided the night after you came home from Charlottetown." She squeezed Marilla's hands. "I've thought about it every day since. Mr. Barry is willing to rent the farm for a year. I'll teach school. Perhaps I won't have Avonlea, but I can teach at Carmody. And I'll live here with you." Marilla shook her head. "Oh, Anne, I can't let you give up everything you've worked for." "There is no sacrifice." Anne looked slowly around the familiar kitchen. The sunlight rested upon the worn floorboards. The clock ticked softly. Outside, the bees drifted lazily among the blossoms. "This is home." She smiled through tears. "My ambitions haven't disappeared. They've simply changed. I thought my future stretched ahead like one long straight road." She paused. "But perhaps life isn't meant to be one straight road." She looked down toward the lane disappearing beyond the orchard. "Perhaps sometimes the loveliest places are found after the road bends." Marilla's eyes filled once more. She reached out and gathered Anne into her arms. "My blessed girl." For the first time in many days, both of them felt hope quietly returning to Green Gables. The days that followed passed quietly at Green Gables. Word soon spread throughout Avonlea that Anne Shirley had given up the Avery scholarship and her plans for Redmond College in order to remain at home with Marilla. Nearly everyone had an opinion. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others declared no sensible girl would turn away from such an opportunity. Many believed Anne was making the greatest mistake of her life. Anne heard the whispers now and then when she went to the post office or stopped at the general store, but they troubled her very little. Her heart was at peace. Every morning she woke beneath the sloping roof of the east gable, looked out across the orchard sparkling with early summer sunshine, and knew she had chosen the path she could live with. Mrs. Allen understood. When Anne met with her in the manse garden one afternoon, The minister's wife took both of Anne's hands. "My dear," she said gently, "I think you have chosen bravely." Those few words meant more to Anne than she could easily express. Mrs. Rachel Lynde, surprisingly enough, approved as well. One soft June evening she came bustling up the Green Gables lane and settled herself upon the stone bench beneath the tall hollyhocks with a long sigh. "I declare, I'm thankful to sit down," she announced. 200 pounds is a great deal for 2 feet to carry around all day. Anne laughed. Mrs. Rachel looked at her with approval. "Well, Anne, I hear you've given up this notion of college. And I was real glad to hear it. You've got as much education as any woman needs. I never did believe in girls filling their heads with Latin and Greek." Anne smiled mischievously. "But I'm still going to study Latin and Greek, Mrs. Lynde." Mrs. Rachel stared. "You are?" "Certainly. I'll simply study them here at Green Gables in the evenings." Mrs. Rachel threw up her hands. "Anne Shirley, you'll work yourself to death." "Not at all," Anne laughed. "I'll be quite moderate." The conversation wandered pleasantly until, almost as an afterthought, Mrs. Rachel said, "I suppose you'll be teaching here in Avonlea after all?" Anne looked up quickly. "I thought the trustees had promised the school to Gilbert Blythe." "They had," Mrs. Rachel nodded, "but Gilbert withdrew his application." Anne blinked. "He withdrew?" "Indeed he did." Mrs. Rachel folded her hands comfortably in her lap. "The very minute he heard you applied, he went straight to the trustees and asked them to give the position to you instead." For a moment Anne could only stare. "He did that for me?" "So Thomas says." Mrs. Rachel nodded approvingly. "It was a handsome thing to do. He'll teach at White Sands instead, though it'll cost him more since you'll have to board there. But he said you ought to have Avonlea." Anne looked silently toward the orchard. The sunlight shimmered softly through the apple leaves. She remembered Gilbert's smile at White Sands, his encouragement before her recitation, his quiet kindness through the years, his refusal to compete against her unfairly. And now, this. "I don't think I ought to accept it," she murmured. Rachel chuckled. "My dear, it's too late for that. Gilbert has already signed with White Sands. The matter is settled." Anne lowered her eyes thoughtfully. For the first time in many years, she saw Gilbert Blythe not as the rival who had challenged her every lesson, but simply as a generous friend. Just then, Mrs. Rachel suddenly peered toward Orchard Slope. "Bless my soul! What does all that waving from Diana's window mean?" Anne laughed. "She's signaling for me. We've never quite outgrown our old ways." She rose lightly from the bench. "I'd better go before she invents some dreadful emergency." Mrs. Rachel watched her run down the clover-covered hill with the easy grace of youth. "There is still a great deal of child about Anne," she said fondly. Marilla smiled. "Yes," she answered quietly, "but there's a great deal more of the woman." As twilight settled gently across Avonlea the following evening, Anne walked alone to the little churchyard where Matthew rested. She carried fresh wildflowers gathered from Green Gables. Kneeling beside the simple grave, she carefully watered the little Scotch rose bush she had planted there. The evening was wonderfully peaceful. Poplar leaves whispered overhead. The grasses stirred softly around the weathered stones. Beyond the churchyard, the lake of shining waters reflected the last pale gold of sunset. Anne remained there for a long while. There was sadness in her heart. There always would be. But sorrow no longer seemed to stand alone. It had become quietly entwined with gratitude. She thought of Matthew's gentle smile, his shy pride, his faithful love, and she realized that every beautiful thing around her still somehow carried a little piece of him. At last she rose and looked out across the valley. The fields glowed beneath the evening sky. The distant sea murmured beyond the hills. The whole world seemed wrapped in gentle peace. "My dear old world," Anne whispered softly. "You are very lovely, and I am glad to be alive in you." She turned toward home, and halfway down the hill, a familiar figure stepped through the gate of the Blythe farm. Gilbert had not yet seen her. He walked with his cap in one hand, softly whistling to himself as the warm evening breeze stirred the maples overhead. Anne slowed her steps. Without quite knowing why, she waited. Anne waited quietly beside the roadside until Gilbert Blythe looked up and saw her. For a moment, he seemed surprised. Then, with the easy courtesy that had always marked him, he lifted his cap and would have walked on had Anne not stepped forward and held out her hand. "Gilbert," she said, her cheeks flushing softly, "I wanted to thank you." He looked at her in surprise. "Thank me? For giving up the Avonlea school?" Gilbert took her hand warmly. "It wasn't particularly good of me at all," he replied. "I was only glad I could do you a small service." Anne smiled. It was much more than a small service. For a few moments they stood together beneath the maples while the evening breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Beyond them, the lake of shining waters reflected the last rosy colors of sunset, and somewhere across the fields a robin sang its final song of the day. Gilbert looked at her earnestly. "Are we going to be friends after this, Anne?" There was no trace of teasing in his voice, only hope. Anne lowered her eyes for a moment. How many years had passed since that foolish quarrel in the Avonlea schoolhouse? How much needless pride had stood between them? She laughed quietly. "I forgave you long ago," she admitted. "I simply didn't know it." Gilbert laughed with her. "What a stubborn little goose you were." "I know." Anne smiled at herself. "I've been sorry for a very long time." His face brightened with an unmistakable happiness. "Then we're friends." "The very best of friends," he declared. "We should have been all along." Anne found herself laughing again. It seemed such a simple thing. How strange that something so simple had taken 5 years. Together they began walking slowly toward Green Gables. "You aren't giving up your studies altogether, are you?" Gilbert asked. "Oh, no." Anne's eyes brightened. "I mean to study every spare hour I can." "So do I," he smiled. "Perhaps we can help each other." "I should like that very much." The rest of the walk passed almost too quickly. They spoke of Queen's Academy, of books they hoped to read, of teaching, of Redmond. Every few moments one of them remembered another forgotten story, and both laughed as though they were making up for 5 years of conversations they had never had. By the time they reached the lane leading to Green Gables, twilight had settled over Avonlea. The first stars shone above the pointed firs. Gilbert stopped at the gate. "I suppose we'd better say good night." "I suppose so." Anne smiled warmly. "Good night, Gilbert." "Good night, Anne." He walked away with a lighter step than when they had met. Anne watched him disappear down the road before turning toward the house. Marilla looked up as Anne entered the kitchen. "Who was that walking with you?" "Gilbert Blythe." Marilla looked at her curiously. "I didn't know you and Gilbert Blythe were such good friends." Anne laughed. "We haven't been." She paused thoughtfully. "We've been very good enemies. And now we've decided it's much more sensible to be good friends." Marilla smiled quietly. "That sounds much better." Later that evening, Anne climbed to the east gable. The familiar little room welcomed her like an old friend. She opened the window wide. Outside, the cherry branches whispered in the evening breeze. The scent of mint drifted softly upward from the garden below. And far away, through the old gap in the firs, Diana's little light glowed warmly across the fields. Anne rested her arms upon the windowsill. So much had changed. Matthew was gone. The future she had dreamed of had changed with him. Redmond would have to wait. Her life would not follow the long, shining road she had once imagined. Yet, strangely enough, she was not unhappy. She thought of Marilla downstairs, of Green Gables, of Gilbert's offered friendship, of Diana's faithful love, of Matthew's gentle smile. The world still seemed full of beauty. There would still be books to read, children to teach, friendships to cherish, dreams yet waiting to be discovered. Her road had become narrower, but it had not ended. She looked out across the moonlit orchard where the Snow Queen stood white and peaceful beneath the stars. Matthew had once called her my girl. She hoped somehow that he knew she was trying to live in a way that would make him proud. A deep, quiet peace settled over her heart. There would be work. There would be sorrow. And there would be joy. And there would always be something beautiful waiting beyond the next turning. Anne smiled into the peaceful night. I don't know what lies around the bend, she whispered. But I believe the best does. The breeze stirred the blossoms outside her window. The stars shone steadily over Green Gables. And somewhere, in the quiet beauty of Avonlea, Anne felt that this life itself was gently smiling back at her. For there was always the bend in the road. And now, the lights at Green Gables grow warm against the quiet night. The orchard rests beneath the stars. The little brook continues its gentle song beyond Lover's Lane. And somewhere, through the old gap in the fir trees, a single light still glows from Diana's window. Though Anne's story has come to its peaceful close, Green Gables will always remain here, waiting beneath the apple blossoms, the autumn maples, the winter snow, and the first violets of spring. Thank you for walking these familiar roads with me, for sharing in Anne's laughter, her dreams, her sorrows, and the quiet hope she found beyond every bend in the road. As summer slowly gives way to autumn, new stories are waiting for us. Soon we'll wander beneath whispering trees dressed in crimson and gold, follow quiet woodland paths, visit sleepy villages wrapped in mist, and gather beside glowing hearth fires where the old tales have been lovingly passed from one generation to the next. There may be moonlit forest, forgotten bridges, friendly ghosts, and just the gentlest touch of autumn mystery. Always peaceful, always comforting, always a place where you can simply rest. So wherever our next story leads, I hope you'll come along. Until then, close your eyes, let the day drift quietly away, and carry a little piece of Green Gables with you. Sleep now. You are safe. You are loved. Thank you for listening to Nicki Woo Cozy Stories, created by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.